Hello and welcome. This is your weekly fix. I'm Smitha Nair. In 8 days, nearly 74,000 seats across the three-tier panchayat system, Gram Panchayat, Panchayat Samiti, and Zilla Parishads in West Bengal will go to the polls. As anticipated, once elections were announced, violence aimed seemingly at preventing candidates from filing their nominations were reported from several districts across the state. In the last panchayat polls in West Bengal in 2018, 34% of Gram Panchayat seats were won uncontested. That number is significantly lesser this time around, even so. The opposition parties, the CPIM, the BJP, the Congress, accused the Trinamool Congress of using violence and the threat of violence to deter their candidates from contesting. What is the significance of the panchayats to the larger social political matrix in the state? Why is political violence endemic to West Bengal? And what explains the paradox of consistent high voter turnouts in all levels of election in the state in the face of this kind of violence? These are some of the questions I'll be asking political scientist Professor Neelanjan Sircar. He's with us now. Thank you, Professor Sircar, for making the time.
Thank you for having me.
Right. Right away, the 73rd Constitutional Amendment passed in the early 90s set in motion what was hoped would be the decentralization of power and resources from the center to locally elected authorities. My question is, in the decades that followed, how important has the control of the panchayati system become to the larger fortunes of political parties across the country? And in what way, if at all, is West Bengal different from other states when it comes to the significance of the panchayat and panchayat elections?
So, I think what I'll do is I'll take the second part of the question first, because West Bengal's panchayat system in some ways precedes what we saw with the 73rd and 74th Amendment. Uh, while local politics and political violence, which we'll talk about a bit later, was evolving even from independence, the panchayat system in West Bengal we associate with the CPM coming to power in 1977 and the Panchayat Act in 78, right? Part of the logic for the left parties at that point was to extend the party some form of democratic decentralization in rural areas. And so, in many ways, the pattern of politics that we associate with West Bengal and the panchayats is actually evolving from that period and not from the amendments that come in the 1990s. Now, I'll talk more about that later because obviously West Bengal has developed a very distinctive form of politics at the panchayat level and the political violence that surrounds it. Just to say that in the country as a whole, I think that democratic decentralization has been much more uneven, right? So typically, those of us who study local politics, we have in our head states that have better local governance, worse local governance. We know there's a distinction between rural local governance and urban local governance. So while I think the motivation very much was there for democratic decentralization, what we've also seen is a lot of retrenchment in the polity, both from political leaders who have centralized power, within their states in the chief ministership or in the prime ministership, but also now increasingly with the way that benefits are being given, part of the strategy has been to cut out the panchayat altogether. So, insofar as there was an economic logic for local governance and sort of bargaining at the local level, a lot of that is being diminished today because of the kind of economic structure that we have. Whereas in places where the local governance was able to generate some form of social control and social mobilization, like West Bengal, there the panchayats remain somewhat relevant.
It's interesting. If I'm understanding what you're saying correctly, you're saying these centrally sponsored so-called welfare schemes, the Labharti, like in Uttar Pradesh, that come directly from the center in a way, bypass the local leaders and the panchayat system, making them almost irrelevant to the process of garnering economic and social benefits.
Absolutely.
Right. That's a great discussion, and I don't want to veer towards it because we'll digress and focus perhaps in the moment on West Bengal. academics like Partha Chatterjee, Professor Sircar, have written about the centrality of the political party to rural life in Bengal, how unlike other states, it isn't caste or religion, but quote, the party that mediates every single sphere of social activity. You referred to this in a piece you wrote in the Hindustan Times last week as well, the phenomenon that political scientist Dwaipayan Bhattacharya calls party society. So, part one of my question, Professor Sircar, is uh, you briefly spoke about how this started much before the 73rd Amendment in the 90s with the coming in of the CPIM. Could you take us through how this sort of come to be this party society as part one? Part two is about violence. We'll come to it in a bit.
So let's. So as I said, there is a prehistory to the left. There was a lot of violence in West Bengal. There is the aftermath of the Bangladesh's liberation war in '71, which creates a lot of violence on the ground. The left front comes to power with this sort of context, right? And so, in a very genuine sense, what you see through the 80s is, of course, a program of land redistribution, which is well known, but also an attempt to generate security and social control and social mobilization, particularly in rural areas. And that's the context in which the panchayats come up, right? In West Bengal, and that explains a lot of the kind of pattern that we see. Now, because that is the context, one good analogy for what the left did and what left parties actually around the world have done is that they began to see the local panchayat as what in traditional left politics was the local branch of a left party. So that is the point at which mobilization, informing the electorate or the citizenry was happening down at that local level. That is what democratic decentralization meant to the left parties and to the panchayat system in that context. So the panchayat very much was not imagined purely as an economic unit, but it was imagined as a unit that is there to inform the public about what the party is doing, perhaps advertise it to bring them into the party, but also as a tool of social mobilization, right? So that sort of bottom up strategy for what the panchayats do. Now, as I sort of briefly mentioned, we can talk about it a bit more. Actually, the world has changed a lot in terms of economic benefits, but that social mobilization role of the panchayats and the ability to control local space, provide security, bring people to the polls in the service of a political party, um, receive state patronage from the top, from police and so on and so forth, in order to conduct their activities. That system is very much intact still in West Bengal.
Right. And let's talk about how violence sort of became this instrument, if one may, to retain this kind of control that the party had units in each village, as you said. Now, our viewers, of course, will know that the Trinamool Congress, when it's accused of being the primary aggressor, as it has been over the last few election cycles, it blames the CPIM for the culture of violence, and the CPIM in turn refers to the Congress, and particularly the 1972 election, the infamous one.
Absolutely, right? I mean, I think we have seen a demonstrated culture of violence in local elections, in even state and national elections in West Bengal, across political parties. And, we do see party violence in other sort of allied states, Kerala, Tripura. In fact, Tripura is a good example because it's another case where even after the left lost and the BJP came into power, the culture of violence still exists. So it tells you that there is actually a larger cultural phenomenon going on here. The first sort of comment I'd like to make about this, and we want to be very clear, is that party violence is, of course, something that's deplorable. We should not encourage this kind of thing in any kind of democratic system. But party violence is only one kind of violence, right? In the northern states, we have a lot of caste violence or religious violence. Gujarat, of course, has had a significant amount of religious violence. It's not at all obvious the scale of one kind of violence is worse or better than another kind of violence. So the reason why I bring that up is not to justify any kind of violence, but to point out that modes of social control are different, right? In West Bengal, the logic of social mobilization has been through the panchayat and through the political party, right? And that's why violence is centered around elections and parties, right? In the north, a lot of the violence has been centered around caste and religion, right? And that's why, and that has been the mode of social control, which is why that is the sphere in which we see violence. So, the logic of violence in West Bengal very much comes from that that initial idea that I tried to sort of put forward, which is the logic of local control of what a panchayat does in terms of mobilization, in terms of protection, is something that A, requires a significant amount of spatial control, B, requires agreement and even tacit approval from above. To just make a very sort of simple example possible, let's say that some panchayat carries out some violence or some intimidation against a subset of those in that panchayat. If that person then goes to a local thana to file a case or tries to go up the ranks, the tacit approval means that that person really can't go anywhere because the thana is actually working lockstep with the panchayat and the higher level party functions are actually working in lockstep with the panchayat. That's what allows the violence to persist, right? That's what allows the panchayat to get the kind of social control that it does. The logic of this kind of violence, therefore, is that not only do I establish social control locally, but there is a commonality in partisanship. If the CPM is winning at the panchayat levels, the CPM needs to win in the levels above for that tacit approval. If the TMC is winning at the local level, then TMC needs to win all the way up for that tacit approval. And that's part of the reason why you see the kind of violence being centered on elections, because establishing that level of local social control for a political party is actually what allows it to continue and percolate up the ranks to state and national level politics and control the state.
To that extent, would I don't know how much of the case in the Calcutta High Court and the Supreme Court on this particular election you followed, but the advocates for the petitioners in the Calcutta High Court last week had made a point that, in the light of what you're saying, seems pertinent. That when you say free and fair elections, it isn't just that X number of people turned up for voting, and West Bengal has consistently had high voter turnout, and that shows there hasn't been any voter intimidation, and therefore the elections are free and fair. For elections to be free and fair, the entire process from the day elections are announced to the time when candidates can file their nominations, withdraw it, there is no violence or threat. The fact that, at least in the panchayat level, as 2018 is a prime example, but we have seen statistics from the 1970s onwards where there have been many seats uncontested, a significant percentage of seats uncontested, shows that other political parties that are not the dominant party in West Bengal have not been able to freely and fairly, for example, field their candidates in these elections. So to that extent, can it be said that elections have been free and fair?
I mean, I think it is a difficult question in the Indian context when you talk about local politics in general. As I said, you have different patterns of social control across space. And we know that caste and religious intimidation is perpetrated in other contexts. Here, party intimidation is what is promulgated, right? So from that pure standard, I'm not sure to what extent local politics anywhere across India meets a standard of free and fair elections. West Bengal is a particularly ugly case, right? Because it is a partisan local election. Panchayat elections have party symbols, and you are actively preventing other parties from filing nominations in order to contest the elections. Um, what I would say, which is a complicated argument to make, so give me about 10, 15 seconds, is that it is true that purely at the procedural level, this kind of election is not free and fair. But it does not follow that what happens in panchayat elections is divorced from social frustrations and what the people want A good example of this is that after the trouble in Shingur and Nondigram, when the CPM had been in power for 30 plus years, the panchayat elections went against the CPM despite all of the social control that they had, all of the goodwill and lack of goodwill they built up over 30 years. That actually the logic of social control is what allows the partisanship to follow, not the other way around. So once you lose social control locally, the other party will win. And social control is, of course, a function of the popularity of the party, the extent to which the party is able to deliver, the extent to which people are or are not frustrated with the party in power.
Okay, that's a good segue to my next question, Professor Sircar. The Trinamool Congress here, that unseated and ended decades of left rule. It was well known. This is in 2011 that despite the absence of an organizational structure that could rival that of the CPIM, the Trinamool Congress seems to have seamlessly gotten into this role of the party in what is referred to as party society.
So I would make a distinction between what the CPM was doing and what the TMC is doing. Certain features of this, as I said, we do have a culture of local violence in politics in West Bengal, and that maintains. One core difference structurally, which you sort of allude to, is that the CPM organizationally is a structure in which the party is first. While you did have a charismatic leader in Jyoti Basu, it certainly wasn't a party about a single leader. The Trinamool Congress is a party that is built around the personage of Mamata Banerjee, right? And now increasingly her nephew. But that is what is there. Now, that actually structurally creates certain differences in the party. One thing that happens, and we talked about something that's happening nationally with centrally sponsored schemes, is that there are avenues for Mamata Banerjee to directly reach the voter outside of the panchayat and the local party structure. A lot of the direct benefit transfers, schemes that are being given within the state. The second thing that happens, and it's been very well publicized, is that there's an extreme level of factionalism on the ground. In many local contexts, the biggest opponent of the Trinamool Congress is the Trinamool Congress itself. It is TMC A versus TMC B, and the two factions don't like each other, right? In fact, it came to such a great extent in this panchayat election that in many places, the TMC waited until the very end to file its nominations just to prevent the other breakaway group from trying to file a nomination as an independent candidate or some such thing, right? So, this actually structurally does change how the party works on the ground. Now, the reason why a lot of it stays intact is what I said. It's that tacit approval up to the top. So where the structure has changed is when the CPM lost local control, everything kind of fell apart on the top. Here, part of what is happening that's allowing the multiple factions to coexist on the ground is that as long as Mamata Banerjee is the unquestioned most popular leader, there is a belief that above a certain level, the TMC will maintain a level of control over the state machinery and, of course, politically win. And that forces the panchayats, no matter what differences may exist between local leaders, to sort of fall in line and follow the TMC. So it's actually the bottom kind of responding to the top, whereas in the other universe, the logic of what the CPM had done was purely a bottom-up process. So while from the outside they look very, very similar, actually structurally there are two very, very different things happening. It's of course feeding into a very similar culture of violence.
What about the entry of the BJP? How has this? How does BJP? What role is it playing in this sort of waves of rounds of violence, particularly around elections that we see, and the showing of the BJP in the 2019 Lok Sabha election, its best ever, winning 18 seats in the state. How does that queer the pitch, if I may?
So, we saw, for those of us who've been following local politics in Bengal for a long time, we kind of saw 2019 coming. And we saw it coming because of the 2018 panchayat election, actually. So, for those who look at the panchayat election even this time, the results will tell you a lot about who is going to be in control where going forward, right? For some of the reasons I've talked about. So, the entry of the BJP, at least spatially, has told us that outside of the core area of support for the TMC, which is the southern part of the state, so in the western edges where the tribal population is larger, and in the northern part of the state, there you have seen the BJP make some inroads. Now, it does seem, at least at first blush, that actually the strength of the party mobilization has actually decreased since 5 years ago in the panchayat election. But what you do see is that in the, let's say, 5 or 6 key districts in the northern part of the state, the BJP is still able to file its nominations and actually wins a fair number of seats and may actually carry those seats even in the next Lok Sabha election, right? And when you go on the ground, it's actually something very, very interesting. When I was doing field work last time, the local leader, it was a panchayat where the sarpanch was from the BJP, but he was only talking about the CPM and the left front. It turns out that he was a functionary of the left front who switched over to the BJP. Then I talked to the opposition leader who was from the TMC and kept on talking about the Congress. The reason was his entire family, everyone was Congress, and then when things changed, they all switched to the TMC. So, in some ways, what you're seeing in the North is a pattern of party structures that have hardened. Labels are changing. So, whereas in the beginning we were thinking about structures following party labels, now in some sense it has flipped. The structures have become so hardened that they may be changing names, but the groups that are contesting actually go back decades, and perhaps the rivalries go back decades, right? And so much of what we're seeing in the BJP is, of course, people who were in the CPM before. That is well established. But you're also seeing a very, very complicated pattern of alliances where, in certain places, the CPM and even the Congress are allying with the BJP, and in other contexts they're not. In the North, the BJP has been able to engineer some of that, right? And the other thing that we've learned from 2018 onward is, and from what I told you about the Tripura elections, is that the BJP is certainly not immune from this culture of violence, right? The BJP is also very capable in certain places and does use local level violence because that is the logic of politics in West Bengal.
And additionally, we can do you see the communal fault line in a sense becoming important in post the entry of the BJP in the manner that we have seen since 2019?
The communal fault line certainly is important. I don't think it operates on the ground in the same way that it does in many, many other contexts. So, one is, of course, the North Indian context is very, very different. A good sort of comparison is Assam, right? A place where the BJP has made very, very strong inroads. There, when you look at the regional level or the constituency level, constituencies are either very large majority Muslim population or very large majority Hindu population. What happens in West Bengal actually is the spatial spread of the Muslim community is far greater. In most places, you're going to see 15, 20% Muslim population, except for the western part of the state, right? So actually the kind of politics that works on the ground for that reason is very different. And you'll see, for instance, Muslims contesting for the BJP and so on and so forth in a way that I think is not as natural in other contexts. So the polarization the BJP has been able to take advantage of, and that is noticeable, is that there had been a budding rivalry which has gotten worse between the lower castes within the state, certain caste communities, scheduled castes, and the Muslim communities, particularly on the Bangladesh border. And there you have seen the return of a certain kind of communal violence with the support of the BJP. So, in those contexts, yes, you have seen a rise of communal violence, but the larger tapestry of West Bengal politics, in some sense, dampens a lot of those pressures. So that's part of the reason why, after somebody saw the 2019 election results in West Bengal, you would have imagined a full blown communal election in 2021. But in fact, you got the opposite, right? because the dampening, both demographic dampening factors and also, sort of what the TMC represents and the kind of social control it's able to manifest on the ground, uh, dampens those sort of communal divides.
Right. In conclusion, Professor Sircar, back to the question of political violence, do you see this changing the nature of political violence, or do you say that do you think, as you said, even the BJP is capable of doing it? It's an imperative of almost a political imperative that this is the method of politics that happens, or will that change?
See, in the short term, it's not going to change. And, I'm going to say something that is a very unhappy reality, but I think that what we're seeing on the ground in terms of publicizing lynchings, intimidation, whether it be the party in power at the top, whether it be a party in power at the state, is only a phenomenon that has grown, right? The ability to demonstrate physical intimidation, if anything, is becoming more standardized in the polity, not the other way around. So until there's a larger political culture in the country, right, that uh, is actually not sympathetic to and actually punishes politicians for demonstrating physical intimidation and violence, right? And this is something that goes from Lalu to Mamata to Yogi Adityanath to Modi, right? Until that kind of more general um, condemnation and punishment happens among the electorate, I don't see this changing. As I've sort of stated from the very beginning, that while West Bengal is a very particular example, it would be wrong to say that this is the only kind of violence that comes in the polity. And in fact, the more common case is violence that is perpetrated along identity based lines, which we see to a great extent in many other parts of India. So we need a general condemnation of all kinds of social and political violence if this culture is to move forward. I don't see somehow West Bengal reforming itself without the rest of India reforming itself.
Right. On that note, thank you, Professor Sircar, for your time and for your insights.
Thank you so much.